Millions watched as host Pam Bondi tried to humiliate Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett on live television, mocking her faith, her strength, and everything she stood for. But in just a few seconds of silence, Jasmine flipped the script without a single harsh word. No outrage, no resistance, just one steady hand resting on a small gold cross, and the entire studio fell completely silent. What happened next stunned the nation, and even brought Pam Bondi to tears on camera. Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The studio burned under artificial suns. Floodlights hung from the ceiling like gods watching from above. The air was thick, not warm, but charged with the pressure of expectation. Cameras darted back and forth, moving like predators, ready to capture every blink, every crack. This wasn't just a talk show. It was a showdown dressed up as entertainment. Pam Bondi stepped out like she owned the place. Her eyes scanned the room with practiced control. Her heels hit the floor like a metronome of authority. She wore a red suit, not just bold, but calculated. It said, "I'm not here to play nice." Pam was famous for breaking people down on live TV. Her voice, smooth and sharp, had taken down guests before they even realized the game had started. She wasn't curious. She was hunting. With a smile just sharp enough to cut, and a posture that dared you to challenge her, she sat like a queen at court. She didn't need to shout. Her silence said enough. "I'm here to win, and I don't care how you feel about it." Then came Jasmine Crockett. She didn't march out to applause. She moved with calm, steady energy. A quiet presence, the kind that takes up space without needing to raise its voice. Her dark blue suit was simple but dignified. Around her neck, a small gold cross rested gently, catching the light only when she turned. She walked like someone who had been through real battles, not just in politics, but in life, and had learned to hold herself with quiet strength. This wasn't her first hostile room. She had walked into courtrooms and congressional hearings where people didn't see her as equal. But she was still here, still standing, and she sat with the kind of poise that made the stage itself feel smaller. Pam didn't wait. The moment Jasmine sat down, she leaned in, smiled tight, voice soft but loaded. "So Jasmine," she said casually, "do you actually believe God still cares about American politics? I mean, come on, really?" Her tone was playful, but underneath was a clear message. "You sound naive, and I'm about to prove it." A few chuckles from the audience followed. Not full laughter, more like people waiting to see a punch land. The room tensed. This was the moment Pam was known for. The opener. The first jab. Just enough to throw her guest off balance. But Jasmine didn't shift, didn't blink, didn't even inhale like someone bracing for a hit. She simply stared back, calm as stone, while something cold and invisible passed between them. It wasn't defiance. It wasn't fear. It was something deeper, quieter, more dangerous. A woman who had already survived worse than a televised jab. The silence between them wasn't awkward. It was intentional. Jasmine sat with the weight of every room that had doubted her, every hallway where she'd been spoken over, every headline that had called her emotional when she was only passionate, inexperienced, when she was simply young and unafraid. The cross at her neck didn't move, but suddenly it felt louder than anything Pam had said, and Pam noticed it. That flash of gold catching the light, not as decoration, but as declaration. She narrowed her eyes, her smile tightened. If Jasmine wouldn't crack under sarcasm, maybe she'd crack under ridicule. Pam leaned forward, her tone now sharper, coated in the kind of laughter that doesn't come from humor, but from a need to humiliate. "Tell me something, Jasmine," she said, voice smooth like polished steel. "If God's really watching us so closely, maybe he should focus on fixing the economy instead of helping politicians win elections, huh?" It was a line rehearsed for applause, and she got it. The audience laughed. Some clapped. One man in the front row let out a loud, ugly snort. The kind of laugh that doesn't just mock, it dismisses. It says you don't belong here. It says you're not taken seriously. The sound echoed through the studio, bouncing off cameras, walls, and faces. Pam reclined slightly in her seat, satisfied. The punchline had landed, but the camera cut to Jasmine, and suddenly everything changed. She didn't smile. She didn't shake her head. She didn't even glance at the crowd. Her gaze stayed level, steady, locked on Pam, not in confrontation, but in clarity. Her right hand moved slowly, gracefully, and came to rest on the cross hanging at her chest. She didn't grip it like a weapon. She just held it, like someone holding a memory. The gold shimmered faintly, catching the light in the stillness. Her eyes deepened, not darker but wider, as though 1,000 thoughts had passed through her in a single breath. She wasn't just holding the cross. She was holding everything it had meant to her over the years. Hospital rooms, empty pews, long nights where faith was the only thing that didn't leave. The laughter began to fade. Not all at once, but piece by piece, like someone slowly turning down the volume on a world that had always spoken over her. People shifted in their chairs. A few blinked hard, unsure what they were watching. The energy in the studio shifted, almost like the air itself had thickened. And then she spoke. No performance, no raised voice. Just a calm, steady breath turned into a sentence. "If I'm still standing," she said, eyes never leaving Pam, "it's not just luck." 7 words, no rage, no tears, just truth. And the room went still. It was as if the lights dimmed without anyone touching the switch. Pam opened her mouth to respond, but nothing came out. Because in that moment, Jasmine hadn't won an argument. She had ended it, before it ever really began. And just like that, the room fell into a silence that wasn't empty. It was earned. Jasmine's words still hung in the air, like smoke after a fire. Pam didn't speak. The audience didn't laugh. Something had shifted, something real. And behind Jasmine's steady gaze, behind that calm voice and simple cross, was a storm the world had never truly seen. Because the woman sitting in that chair hadn't come from comfort. She had come through fire. And to understand her silence, you had to know the war it came from. What looked like peace was built on battle. What looked like grace was born from grief. Years ago, long before the lights and microphones, Jasmine Crockett walked into courtrooms that didn't want her there. She was a public defender, fresh out of law school, black, female, unbent. She stepped into buildings older than her grandmother, where every face seemed to ask the same question before she even opened her mouth. "What are you doing here?" She didn't come from connections or legacy. She came from sweat, from borrowed textbooks, from nights spent studying under flickering lamps while bills piled up beside her. In court, she wasn't just arguing for her clients. She was arguing for her right to exist in that space. Judges talked over her. Colleagues undermined her. One senior attorney once joked during lunch that she must have gotten her license in a cereal box. The others laughed. She didn't. But that wasn't the worst of it. As her reputation grew, so did the resistance. People didn't like a young woman who spoke plainly, who didn't water herself down to make others comfortable. The threats started small, an anonymous voicemail saying she was pushing too hard. Then came the hate mail. Then came the message scrawled in marker across her car windshield. "You're not safe here." She filed reports. No one followed up. The system she worked in suddenly felt like it was turning on her. Still, she showed up, every day. Same briefcase, same heels, same tired breath in the elevator mirror as she told herself, "One more day. Just get through one more day." And then it got personal. Her cousin, Marcus, a father, a mentor, the first person who ever told her she was meant for something bigger, shot at a political protest gone wrong. He wasn't even marching. He was walking his bike past the barricades when someone panicked and pulled a trigger. Jasmine was on the house floor when she got the call. She didn't cry until hours later, after the cameras were off. She flew straight to the hospital, only to arrive too late. A week later, she stood at his funeral. No fanfare, no press. Just a folding chair under gray skies, her hand in her coat pocket, clutching the small gold cross he gave her when she passed the bar exam. That was the day she stopped praying for answers. She didn't want explanations anymore. She just wanted strength. No reporters were there when she buried him. No statements were made. Just her, the wind, the silence, and a memory she would carry like a wound she never tried to hide. That cross never left her pocket after that. It became her reminder. Not of religion in the way people talk about it on stages or in debates, but of resilience, of what it costs to believe in something when the world keeps giving you reasons not to, of what it means to hold on to hope, not because it's easy, but because letting go would be even harder. She didn't pray for miracles. She prayed for one more ounce of strength, one more reason to get up, one more reason not to give in. So when she touched that cross on the show, when she sat in front of that crowd and didn't flinch, it wasn't a gesture. It was a memory, a promise, a quiet oath between her and everything she'd survived. Because Jasmine Crockett didn't build her life on luck. She built it on loss and still chose not to let that loss make her bitter. And if looked close enough at her eyes in that moment, you'd see it too. Not pain, not pride, just a woman who'd been through hell and decided to keep walking anyway. Jasmine's story hadn't been shouted. It had been revealed one scar at a time with the kind of quiet that only survivors understand. And just when it seemed the moment might finally settle, when even the light seemed to dim a little in respect, Pam leaned forward again. Not because she had something meaningful to add, but because she couldn't stand the feeling of not being in control. She could sense it. The room had started to slip from her grip. The center of gravity was no longer her. And that terrified her in a way she wouldn't admit. So instead, she went for the only tool she had left. Mockery. Her smile was thinner now, sharp around the edges. Her voice softened, but only in the way a snake softens before it strikes. "Let's be real," she said, waving a hand with rehearsed ease. "Religion? Faith? It's just a pillow people cry into when they can't deal with reality. It's a bedtime story for grown-ups afraid of the dark." The words didn't just fill the air. They cut through it. Cold, clinical, cruel. This wasn't satire. It wasn't a challenge. It was the kind of sentence meant to belittle someone's entire way of surviving. A few nervous chuckles escaped from the back rows, but they came too late and too light. Even the people laughing weren't sure why anymore. The camera turned to Jasmine. Her face didn't change, but something in her eyes deepened, like a door quietly closing. She didn't react the way people expected. No anger, no sharp retort. She simply looked at Pam like someone watching a child throw stones at something they didn't understand. Slowly, she sat back, adjusted the sleeves of her jacket, and gently touched the cross on her chest. Not to show it, not to flaunt it, just to feel it. Like someone reminding themselves they were still here. Her fingers rested there, over years of buried pain and layered grace. Then she spoke, and though her voice was quiet, it filled the room like a rising tide. "Maybe you're right," Jasmine said, her gaze unflinching. "Maybe some people do turn to faith because they're scared. Maybe some of us are holding on, not because we're strong, but because we know what it's like to fall apart." A pause. You could hear the cameras clicking in the back, trying to catch it, as if they knew history was happening in that silence. Then came the next words, steady and low, but undeniable. "But if I have to choose between faith and hate, I'll choose faith. Every single time." The room didn't just quiet, it stilled. The laughter died in people's throats. The energy shifted, heavy and slow, like air before a storm. In the third row, an older black man, dressed in a pressed Sunday suit, lowered his head, his eyes glassy. His granddaughter, no older than 10, sat beside him, watching Jasmine like she was watching a sermon her soul somehow already knew. Across the aisle, a woman in her 70s pressed a trembling hand to her lips. No one said a word. No one had to, because something rare had just happened, something honest. A truth had been spoken, not for applause, not for effect, but because it needed to be. It wasn't a mic drop. It wasn't a performance. It was a confession, wrapped in dignity, delivered without pride. Jasmine hadn't come to win an argument. She had come to show what it looks like when a person refuses to become what the world has tried to make them. And for one long, breathtaking moment, no one in that studio, no matter their beliefs, could look away. And just as the weight of Jasmine's final words settled over the room like ash after a wildfire, the world seemed to take one breath, and then everything changed. At first, it was a flicker, barely noticeable. One of the studio lights blinked, just once, like an eye fluttering in disbelief. Then another. A low electrical hum cut through the air, sharp and sudden, like a wire had snapped behind the walls. The camera feed stuttered. Screens across the country, phones, TVs, live streams, glitched into a smear of pixels. For a split second, the screen went black. The broadcast dropped. 10 full seconds, 10 slow, suspended, pulseless seconds. The entire studio fell into an eerie stillness. Not planned, not rehearsed. The kind of silence that doesn't come from confusion, but from something ancient, something almost sacred. No one moved. Not Pam, not the crew, not even the audience. Now frozen in mid-breath, eyes wide like they were watching something they couldn't explain and weren't supposed to interrupt. The lights dimmed down to a soft amber glow, as if the studio itself had bowed its head. And when the feed came back, when the screens lit up again and the static cleared, there was Jasmine, unmoved, still seated, still calm. Her hands folded gently in her lap, and the soft spotlight, now no longer harsh or clinical, caught her cross in just the right way. It glinted, not like gold, but like something alive. It shimmered with memory, with weight, with defiance that didn't need volume to be heard. And in that moment, no one dared speak. Not because of technical difficulties, not because of fear, but because the room had changed. The mood wasn't dramatic. It was reverent, like something had walked in that no one invited, but no one wanted to disrespect. A man near the back removed his hat and placed it over his chest without even realizing. A woman clutched her rosary with shaking hands. The silence was not empty. It was full of emotion, of questions, of something too deep to name. And while no one could say what had just happened, every soul in that room felt it. Something real had cracked through the broadcast. And for once, the world listened, not to a sound, but to a stillness that said everything. And just when it felt like the silence might settle into something unforgettable, reality crashed back in. Not through words, but through wires. The air in the studio was still thick with emotion, the kind that clings to skin and lingers in the chest. People were still processing what they had felt, what they had witnessed, when suddenly phones across the room lit up. First one, then a dozen, then dozens more. A leaked video was spreading like wildfire, faster than the cameras could cut, faster than the producers could spin. It wasn't part of the broadcast. It wasn't meant to be seen, but it was real, raw, and it exposed everything. The footage, shaky and muffled, came from behind the scenes, from a tech assistant's phone, recording the audio feed in the control room. The voices weren't loud, but they were unmistakable. "Push her on the God stuff," one voice said. "Keep pressing. Make her sweat. If she snaps, we win." Another chuckled. "She's too damn calm. Crack her." That's the clip. There was no outrage in their voices, just strategy. It wasn't about truth. It wasn't about understanding. It was about baiting a woman of faith into bleeding on camera so they could sell the spectacle. The setup had been real. The cruelty, deliberate. The entire interview had been a trap. Not to hear Jasmine, but to shake her, to provoke her into becoming something she wasn't. And now the whole world knew. The audience saw it. Every screen in the room lit up with that clip, and the faces that once smirked with expectation now slowly turned pale. The laughter that had filled the space just minutes before now echoed back like shame bouncing off walls. People looked at each other, then back at Jasmine, not with judgment anymore, but with realization. She had known. She had felt the snare from the moment she walked in, and still she sat there. Still she spoke gently. Still she refused to be turned into something ugly. She could have yelled. She could have stood up, called it out, burned the set down with truth. But she didn't. Instead, she breathed. Then with every camera pointed her way, she looked across the studio, eyes calm, steady, and impossibly clear, and spoke in a voice that wrapped around the silence like a thread stitching something broken back together. "I don't pray to win against anyone," she said. "I pray not to become an enemy to myself." The words didn't boom. They didn't echo, but they didn't have to. They landed with the weight of someone who had lived that prayer, not once but over and over. In courtrooms, in funerals, in hotel rooms after hate mail arrived with no return address. The room was still, completely, not frozen in shock, but in reverence. A woman in the second row pressed a tissue to her cheek, no longer trying to hide the tears. A man in the back put his hand over his heart like he was in church. A college student stopped recording and just listened. Really listened. Because this wasn't a soundbite. This wasn't a campaign moment. This was a human being sitting in the center of a machine built to chew her up and choosing instead to hold her ground with grace. Jasmine didn't look like someone who just exposed a scandal. She looked like someone who had outlived too many already. And yet here she was, choosing dignity in the face of mockery, choosing stillness where others wanted chaos, choosing to remain whole while the world begged her to break. And in that moment, for the first time, the studio didn't feel like a battlefield anymore. It felt like a mirror, one that showed everyone in that room and everyone watching at home, not just who Jasmine Crockett was, but who they were when faced with truth wrapped in gentleness. And for many, it was the first time they didn't look away. And as Jasmine's final words settled into the silence like the last echo in a cathedral, something shifted, not in the crowd, not in the cameras, but in Pam. For the first time that night, the sharpness in her posture began to soften. Her shoulders, once squared and unshakable, dipped by a fraction. Her fingers fidgeted at the edge of her note cards, notes she had written hours earlier with confidence, notes that now felt like weapons made for a battle that no longer existed. She glanced at the teleprompter, then away, her mouth opened, ready to deliver another jab, another pivot, but nothing came out. Not because she didn't have words, but because she no longer trusted them. The mask of control she'd worn so effortlessly, polished, rehearsed, untouchable, was beginning to slip, and underneath something raw peeked through. Not anger, not offense. Something far more dangerous for someone like her. Doubt. She tried to smile. She even chuckled, but it was thin, cracked around the edges, the kind of laugh people force when they're hoping it will sound like confidence. "Well," she said, her voice trailing off before the sentence could finish. It was the first sentence that didn't land, the first moment she wasn't driving the show. Her eyes darted toward the audience, searching for an anchor, for the applause she had relied on just minutes earlier. But the room wasn't giving her anything. No laughter, no support, just quiet, waiting, watching. The kind of quiet that doesn't judge, but sees. And what it saw now was a woman no longer performing, but exposed. Pam licked her lips, her gaze briefly falling to the floor. Her hands trembled, not enough for the camera to catch unless you were looking. But Jasmine saw it. Everyone saw it. The host who had built her career, dismantling others, was, for the first time, unraveling gently on air. Not with theatrics, with humanity. And the cruel irony of it all? Jasmine hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't fought back. She had simply refused to become what they expected. And in doing so, she had held up a mirror that Pam hadn't prepared to look into. And now, for the first time all night, Pam wasn't fighting a guest. She was fighting herself. And as Pam sat in stunned silence, no longer the one controlling the moment, but simply a witness to something far bigger than herself, the weight of what had just happened began to stretch far beyond the walls of the studio. It moved like a slow, invisible wave, one that didn't crash, but rolled through timelines, comment sections, and living rooms across the country. Within minutes, the broadcast clip was everywhere. But it wasn't the debate that caught fire. It wasn't the tension. It wasn't even the words. It was the stillness. That 10-second blackout where nothing happened. And yet everything changed. People couldn't stop replaying it, not for drama, not for spectacle, but because it felt like something sacred, something unfiltered, something they hadn't felt in a long, long time. The hashtags began quietly at first. A few viewers, shaken and unsure how to describe what they felt, typed number, "Let he are believe." Then it caught on. Then it ignited. Silence is power. This is faith. Jasmine did not flinch. Within an hour, it was trending in multiple countries, not just among religious circles, but from people across every spectrum: faith leaders, veterans, teachers, college kids, artists, even outspoken atheists. Not all of them believed in God, but they believed in what they saw, in the dignity of someone refusing to betray herself, in the strength of not fighting fire with fire, in the grace of restraint in a culture obsessed with dominance. She had spoken for every person who had been told their beliefs were inconvenient, old-fashioned, or naive. She had stood for every person who had once felt cornered and chose not to lash out, but to stay whole. And yet, as the noise outside grew louder, Jasmine said nothing. No press release, no interviews, no retweets. She didn't explain herself or try to shape the narrative. She didn't capitalize on the moment. She simply let it be what it was. 20 hours later, while pundits still argued and headlines still spun, Jasmine posted a single photo. No caption, no tags, just an image, quiet, grounded, and breathtaking in its simplicity. A small, worn gold cross resting gently on top of a weathered copy of the U.S. Constitution. The light in the image was natural, falling from a window, warm and soft, casting faint shadows along the leather cover. No glamour, no production, just truth. A truth not shouted but held. The reaction was immediate and overwhelming, but different this time. Not outrage, not debate, but stillness. Thousands of people shared it with their own captions. This says everything. I felt this. This is what strength looks like. Some wrote paragraphs, others just posted a single word. Respect. The photo was printed and framed in offices. It became phone wallpapers. Parents showed it to their children. Pastors used it in Sunday sermons. Even people who had never worn a cross before posted selfies wearing one. Not for fashion, but as a quiet nod to something inside them that had been stirred awake. And still, Jasmine said nothing more. She didn't need to, because in a time when everyone was rushing to be heard, she had reminded the world that being heard isn't always about being loud. That one image became more than a post. It became a turning point. Not because it asked anyone to believe what she believed, but because it defended her right to believe it without apology. And in doing so, it gave others permission to do the same. Not just the faithful, but the broken, the searching, the silent, the ones holding their beliefs close, afraid the world would laugh or label or rip them apart. Jasmine had not spoken for attention. She had spoken to survive. And in her silence, millions finally felt seen. And while Jasmine's quiet had become a storm moving through hearts and homes, another kind of silence was brewing in a very different place. This one didn't come with grace. It came with weight. The kind that sits on your chest at night when the applause fades and all you're left with is your reflection. For nearly 2 days, Pam Bondi said nothing. No rebuttal, no tweets, no interviews. Her usual presence on the morning shows vanished. Her team stayed quiet. The studio didn't defend her. The network issued no statement. But the internet kept asking, where is she? What was once a carefully controlled image, strong, unshakable, untouchable, was now noticeably absent. People weren't just watching Jasmine anymore. They were watching Pam and waiting. Then 48 hours after the broadcast, a video appeared. No filter, no edits, just a single take. Pam Bondi, sitting in what looked like a guest bedroom, hair pulled back, no makeup, eyes tired but honest. There was no soft lighting, no production value. The background was a faded painting and a crooked lamp. Her voice when it came wasn't loud. It wasn't even confident. It was human. I wasn't going to say anything, she began, looking down for a moment. I didn't want to make it worse. I didn't want to make it about me. But the truth is, maybe it already was. She paused, her breath shaky. For a long time, I thought faith was a weakness, something people used to hide behind. I told myself the strong didn't need it, that the world belonged to the ones who didn't flinch. She looked directly into the lens then, and for the first time, the audience didn't see a host or a prosecutor. They saw a woman sitting with her own reckoning. But what I saw that night, what we all saw, was something I wasn't ready for, she said, her voice cracking slightly. I saw someone who didn't flinch, not because she didn't feel the pressure, but because she'd already learned to carry it. Her eyes welled up, and she didn't look away. didn't blink it back. The tears came slowly, not dramatic, but raw. She wiped one with the back of her hand, the kind of gesture people do when they forget the camera's on. I used to think only the weak needed faith, she said quietly. But maybe it takes more strength than I ever had to hold on to it when the world laughs at you. The video didn't go viral in the traditional way. It didn't spike with likes and fire emojis. It moved slower, deeper. People watched it twice, 3 times, not for gossip, but because it felt like something rare, a public figure putting down the mask without being forced to. The comment section was unlike anything seen on her feed before. There was no partisan war, no culture clash. Just people saying things like, "I didn't expect this. Thank you for saying what I couldn't." That took courage. Because even in that moment of reflection, Pam didn't spin it. She didn't suddenly claim to see the light. She didn't praise Jasmine just to look good. She spoke only what she could speak truthfully. "I wasn't convinced," and she said, looking off camera as if searching for the words. "I wasn't persuaded, but I was moved, deeply." That sentence, unscripted, uncalculated, hit people harder than most speeches. I wasn't persuaded. I was moved. It was the kind of honesty people weren't used to hearing anymore, especially from someone like her. Someone trained to win arguments. Someone trained to stay ahead of the narrative. But for once, Pam wasn't trying to win. She was trying to understand. Not Jasmine, not Faith, but herself. And in that quiet, 6-minute video, she gave millions of people permission to do the same. There was something poetic in the reversal. The woman who built a career on exposing others had now, without intention, exposed herself. Not to shame, not to scorn, but to a kind of honesty the world had nearly forgotten how to hold space for. Her confession wasn't a collapse. It was a crack. And through that crack, something real shined through. Something unguarded, something that said, "I'm still learning. And maybe I was wrong." It wasn't redemption, it wasn't repentance, it was reflection. And for many watching, men in their 50s who'd never cried in front of their sons, women who'd been mocked in boardrooms for their values, young people who'd left their faith quietly years ago, it felt like a moment where the walls of cynicism lowered just a bit, where someone finally admitted what so many feel but never say out loud. I wasn't broken by faith. I was humbled by it. Pam's video didn't erase the past. It didn't make her a hero, but it did something rarer. It made her human. And in a time where being loud is mistaken for being right, and being first is mistaken for being wise, her small voice in that dimly lit room reminded people that the most powerful transformations often start not with answers, but with questions we're finally brave enough to ask. And in the end, it wasn't Jasmine who asked her to apologize. It wasn't the public who demanded it. It wasn't the backlash that broke her. It was a moment, 10 seconds of silence, and a woman who didn't flinch that made Pam Bondi look in the mirror and say, "Maybe I don't know everything I thought I did." And that, more than anything else, is what moved people. Not the tear, not the words, but the courage it takes to say, "I wasn't convinced. I was moved." The video had barely been live for 10 minutes before it started spreading like a whisper you couldn't unhear. There was no trailer, no announcement, no PR rollout, just a sudden upload from a verified account, the same account that had once shared bold clips, fiery debates, and viral takedowns. But this was something else. No makeup, no lighting, no music, just Pam Bondi in a guest room, speaking slowly, sometimes shakily, into her phone. There was no attempt to curate the frame. The ceiling fan was crooked. A stack of laundry rested quietly in the corner. She didn't clear her throat before she started. She just spoke like someone had been holding it in for too long. And within hours, the entire country was listening. In the beginning, people didn't know how to react. The ones who had cheered her on during the broadcast didn't expect this. The ones who had written her off as cold and cruel didn't know what to make of the vulnerability. It wasn't a tearful meltdown. It wasn't a PR stunt. It was something else entirely. A kind of quiet reckoning caught on camera. Pam didn't apologize. She didn't reverse her opinions. What she did was something rarer. She admitted what most public figures are trained never to admit, that something had reached her in a way she didn't expect and couldn't ignore. "I wasn't persuaded," she said. "I was moved." That line struck like lightning in slow motion. Comment sections froze, as if even the algorithms didn't know how to process sincerity anymore. Some people typed long paragraphs unpacking what it meant. Others just reposted the clip with a single word: respect. Even those who didn't agree with Pam ideologically found themselves sitting in the unexpected presence of a human being daring to be unsure. And in an era where conviction is often confused with volume, that was more than unusual. It was almost revolutionary. The hashtags didn't trend in the usual way. They didn't explode overnight with bots and brand deals. They grew slowly, quietly, like roots beneath the surface of a storm-ravaged forest. Let her believe. Silence is power. Jasmine did not flinch. The hashtags weren't just about Jasmine anymore. They were about what Jasmine had stood for and what Pam had finally recognized. That belief, no matter how personal, deserves space. And that grace, even when uncomfortable, is not weakness. It's courage. Media outlets scrambled to respond. Some conservative channels tried to downplay the video's sincerity. Others leaned into it like a confession. Progressive platforms didn't gloat. They paused. Because somehow the lines between sides had started to blur. This wasn't a political shift. It was human. People weren't celebrating a win. They were sitting in something heavier, something closer to a collective reckoning. It wasn't just about two women anymore. It was about us. The way we consume, the way we demand sound bites, the way we treat vulnerability like a spectacle and faith like a flaw. Then came the responses from ordinary people. Not celebrities, not verified accounts, just voices. Quiet, strong, often trembling with something they hadn't shared before. A middle-aged nurse from St. Louis posted, "I haven't gone to church in 15 years, but tonight I sat on my kitchen floor and cried like I was 5. Not because I believe again, but because someone reminded me I'm allowed to." A retired Marine wrote, "I've seen things I don't talk about. I've done things I'm not proud of. But that woman, Jasmine, made me feel peace for the first time in decades." A college student in Brooklyn posted a selfie with her grandmother's cross, captioned, "I stopped wearing this after high school. I think I'll start again." And Jasmine? She said nothing. No live stream, no statement, no reaction video, no sponsored post, just silence. Until 20 hours later, an image appeared on her official page. No caption, no fanfare. Just a photo, a small worn gold cross resting gently on top of a soft leather copy of the U.S. Constitution. The lighting wasn't theatrical. It was morning light, falling in slanted rays across the pages, casting shadows in the quiet way truth always does. And that photo, that one still frame, said what 1,000 think pieces couldn't. The symbolism hit differently depending on who you were. For some, it was a message of faith without shame. For others, it was a reclaiming of patriotism from those who had used it as a weapon. For many, it was a call. You can believe in something. You're allowed to. The Constitution and the cross, the country and the conscience. It wasn't a battle cry. It was a reminder that the two don't have to cancel each other out, that maybe in the hands of someone steady, they could sit together in peace. The photo was reposted by artists, veterans, professors, bartenders, mothers, students, even inmates. It wasn't framed by political outrage. It was framed by presence. One man in Nebraska printed the photo and taped it to his toolbox. A teacher in Georgia asked her students to write about what the image made them feel. A woman in Phoenix walked into a tattoo shop and asked for the cross and Constitution side by side over her heart. It wasn't about theology. It wasn't about policy. It was about space. Space for belief. Space for reverence. Space for silence. In the days that followed, something strange happened. The noise online didn't just pause. It softened. Comment threads grew longer, but less cruel. People disagreed without tearing each other apart. Not everywhere. Not always. But in enough corners of the internet to make people notice. Like dust finally settling after years of shouting. And it all traced back to one moment, a woman who didn't fight back, and another who admitted she was moved by that choice. News anchors who had built careers on sarcasm found themselves talking slower, softer. Podcasts known for sarcasm started asking deeper questions. Even late-night hosts, masters of turning everything into a punchline, let the clip play without jokes for the first time in years. It wasn't because they had nothing to say. It was because they realized, finally, that maybe not everything needs to be said. And while analysts debated whether this moment was a fluke or the start of something bigger, the public quietly decided. They bought more crosses. They sat in more pews. They took longer walks without headphones. They looked people in the eyes more often. Something had cracked, but not broken. Something had opened. And through it all, Jasmine said nothing else. Because she didn't need to. You could feel it in the silence between headlines. The world didn't move on. It tried. Newsrooms scrambled to push the next scandal, the next tweet storm, the next war of words. Politicians shifted focus. Influencers posted louder, faster, more provocatively. But none of it stuck. None of it felt real enough. Because somewhere in the back of everyone's mind, whether they said it out loud or not, that moment still echoed. The blackout, the whisper, the stillness, the cross. It had settled into the cultural bloodstream like something sacred, something we didn't know we needed until we saw it. And now we couldn't shake it. What happened on that stage wasn't just another viral moment. It wasn't noise. It was an interruption of noise, a crack in the chaos through which something older, quieter, more powerful slipped in. And the strange thing? People didn't want to let it go. They watched the clip again and again, not to analyze it, but to feel it. It was studied like scripture. It was slowed down frame by frame. Jasmine's eyes, Pam's hands, the cross, the blackout. The 10 seconds of silence were looped on meditation apps. Playlists appeared titled Jasmine's Stillness. TikTok surfaced, not mocking but honoring. No filters, just people watching and crying and not knowing why. It became a kind of emotional ink blot. Everyone saw something different in it. For some, it was about faith under fire. For others, it was about dignity in public space. Some saw a woman standing tall while others tried to tear her down. Others saw a mirror held up to the soul of a nation that had forgotten how to listen. One therapist in Portland described it as a collective nervous system reset. A combat veteran in Tennessee called it the calm I've needed for 20 years. A pastor in Detroit played it for his congregation in place of a sermon. A woman in Utah projected it onto the side of her barn and invited the whole town to sit in silence beneath the stars. In Washington, D.C., the moment sparked a rare conversation across party lines, not about policy, but about presence. Lawmakers who rarely agreed on anything admitted they had watched it alone in their offices. Some cried, some prayed, some just sat there, the way you do when something honest hits you before you're ready. It was humbling, and humbling is rare in halls of power. In classrooms across the country, teachers rewrote lesson plans. In high schools, civics teachers played the clip and asked students to write about what they saw, not what they thought, but what they felt. And the answers surprised them. One sophomore wrote, "I've never seen someone win by doing nothing, but now I get it." Another said, "She looked like my mom when she's trying not to break." A third, "I didn't think you could be strong and quiet at the same time." Even law schools and media ethics classes began using the interview as a case study. Professors paused the frame at key moments. Jasmine's pause before speaking, the studio's uncomfortable laughter, the flicker in Pam's eyes when something cracked. Students discussed not just the words but the atmosphere, how power moved across silence, how restraint became the loudest voice in the room. They debated intention, impact, exploitation, and grace. And most left those classes not with answers, but with better questions. Across small towns and big cities, something began to rise. Not outrage, not activism, but awareness. The kind that doesn't burn hot and fast, but slow and deep. People started noticing how often they interrupt others, how quick they are to judge belief they don't share, how easy it is to mock what you don't understand. Churches, synagogues, mosques, yoga studios, even coffee shops began organizing evenings of silence. No phones, no speeches, just people sitting in a room together, remembering what it feels like to just be. A nonprofit in Chicago launched a campaign called the 10 Seconds Project, asking people to share a single moment in their lives when they chose silence over reaction. Submissions poured in. A father who forgave the man who crashed into his daughter's car. A woman who walked away from a fight with her sister instead of saying something she couldn't take back. A teacher who closed her eyes and prayed before replying to a student who cursed her out. These stories weren't dramatic. They were true, and they resonated, because Jasmine had given people something they didn't know they were missing: permission to be still. Jasmine, of course, remained absent from the spotlight. She declined interviews, avoided panels, turned down book deals. She was seen occasionally entering the Capitol with a file folder in that same quiet posture. Cameras still followed her, but she never changed her pace, never looked for the lens. It was like she had already said everything she needed to say, and now her job was to live it. The silence around her wasn't strategic, it was sacred. And yet people kept talking, not to fill the silence, but to honor it. A radio station in Texas aired the full, uncut audio of the moment, followed by 10 minutes of nothing but ambient room tone. No music, no ads, just breathe. And thousands of listeners called in to say thank you. A man in his 70s said, "I've lived through wars, riots, 3 divorces, and a heart attack. That 10 minutes made me feel more than all of them." A teenager said, "It made me feel like maybe peace isn't boring. Maybe peace is brave." In art studios and poetry circles, the still image of Jasmine in the chair became a muse. Sketches, paintings, digital renderings flooded social media. In each one, the cross was drawn a little brighter, the air around her a little heavier. Some artists depicted the blackout moment as a burst of light behind her, as if the darkness had bowed to her presence. Others drew the studio as a courtroom, a cathedral, a battlefield. The metaphors multiplied, but the emotion stayed the same. She had become more than a person. She had become a presence. And yet no monument was built, no holiday created, no formal recognition offered. There were no awards, no magazine covers, no viral confetti. And that, perhaps, was the most honest tribute of all. Because the moment wasn't about spotlight, it was about shadow, the quiet in between, the strength to sit still when the world wants you to shout. And while the noise resumed, as it always does, it returned softer, different, a little more aware of itself. Jasmine Crockett never changed the laws of the land. She didn't write a bestseller or start a movement. She didn't need to. What she did was far rarer. She reminded people that the human soul still responds to stillness, that not all strength is loud. That belief, real belief, doesn't demand agreement. It asks for room. And she took her seat and made space for all of us. You could feel it in the silence between headlines. The world didn't move on. It tried. Newsrooms rushed to flood the feeds with scandal, outrage, distraction. Politicians pivoted. Algorithms refreshed. Influencers leaned into louder colors and angrier captions. But none of it landed. None of it stuck. Because beneath all that noise, something quieter refused to leave. Like the low hum of something holy still vibrating under the surface. People didn't know how to name it, but they knew how it made them feel. The blackout, the cross, the stillness. The moment Jasmine Crockett refused to fight, and, in doing so, won something much larger than the room. It wasn't just the interview that stuck, it was the echo of it. Not because it went viral, but because it went visceral. It didn't hit like a headline. It sank in like a truth you'd always known but had forgotten how to say. And no matter how fast the media machine tried to churn past it, people kept returning to that moment, watching it, sharing it, sitting with it. There were no explosions, no outbursts, just 10 seconds of stillness. And the entire country held its breath. The clip became its own kind of modern scripture. Watched in living rooms and on long train rides. Played in hospital waiting rooms. Discussed over kitchen tables. Replayed not for the drama, but for the absence of it. No yelling, no deflection. Just a woman, unmoved, under pressure, and the unbelievable silence that followed. It became a loop people turned to when they needed something no tweet could offer. Peace. And then came the interpretations. Everyone saw something different. That was the magic of it. A veteran saw discipline. A widow saw grief held with grace. A mother saw her daughter's quiet courage. A pastor saw testimony without words. A therapist saw an entire culture realizing it was starving for stillness. One teacher called it a sacred interruption in a world of noise. A poet described it as a full sermon preached without ever raising her voice. And somewhere deep down, everyone agreed. Something inside us shifted. In churches, it replaced sermons. In college classrooms, it replaced lectures. In corporate boardrooms, it was shown in leadership training. Even in prisons, the clip was shown during reflection sessions. In one maximum security facility, 27 inmates sat in total silence watching Jasmine's moment. And when it ended, no one spoke for almost a minute. Then one man said, "She looked like she knew how to survive without getting bitter." No one laughed, they just nodded. The phenomenon moved beyond religion, beyond politics, beyond category. People didn't care anymore if Jasmine was left or right, if she prayed in pews or on sidewalks. They just saw someone hold herself with a strength that wasn't loud, but lasted. The kind of strength that didn't ask to be validated. It just was. Unapologetic, undeniable. And while the country tried to resume its usual rhythm, Jasmine's presence disrupted it. Not with force, but with weight. Like something had been dropped in the middle of the timeline that made everyone walk quieter for a while. Mornings changed. Families talked more softly at breakfast. Strangers made eye contact in elevators. It didn't happen everywhere, but it happened enough to notice. In a small town in Kansas, a teacher replaced detention with a 10-minute reflection room, playing Jasmine's clip on loop with headphones. Students said it helped, not just to calm down, but to remember who they wanted to be. In Detroit, a retired mechanic hand-painted a mural of Jasmine's silhouette over a faded church wall with the words, "Let her believe, let her breathe." In Los Angeles, a popular cafe installed a Jasmine booth, a phone-free, voice-free table where people could sit in silence, think, pray, or do nothing at all. There were no rules, no slogans, no movement trying to take credit. Just people responding to something real. Pam Bondi's video only added to it. Her admission wasn't seen as defeat, it was seen as proof. Proof that even those trained to argue, to perform, to dominate could be touched by grace. People saw it not as weakness, but as a rare kind of integrity. "I wasn't persuaded," she had said. "I was moved." Those words became tattooed on arms, stitched onto jackets, pinned onto vision boards. Not because they were flashy, but because they were honest. In journalism schools, the moment became required study, not for media bias or interview technique, but for ethical tension. Professors asked, what happens when you build a stage designed for spectacle and the guest refuses to play the game? What happens when stillness wins in a space built for chaos? No one had a perfect answer, but the questions mattered. Meanwhile, Jasmine stayed out of sight. No tours, no interviews. She was seen occasionally walking into the Capitol, always with a folder in hand, always with that same quiet strength. Her silence didn't make her irrelevant. It made her revered, not like a celebrity, but like a lighthouse. Still, solid, lit from within. And then came the art. Portraits, paintings, sketches, murals, digital renderings. Over and over, artists recreated that moment. Jasmine in the chair, light softly touching the cross on her chest. Some drew the studio lights fading into stained glass. Others painted the 10 seconds of darkness as a storm parting around her. One powerful piece titled "Unmoved" showed Jasmine seated while wolves circled, yet none dared touch her. Music followed. A cellist composed a piece called 10 Seconds, using only soft plucks and drawn notes. A folk singer wrote a song titled "She Didn't Flinch." Spotify playlists named number "Let Her Believe in Stillness" is power reached millions of streams, and not one of these projects was commissioned. They were born, out of reverence, out of resonance. In Texas, a radio station aired Jasmine's segment, "Uncut," followed by 10 full minutes of silence. No ads, No voiceover, no music, just 10 minutes of air. They expected complaints. Instead, they received hundreds of thank you letters. One caller said, "That was the first time I heard nothing and didn't want it to end." Another wrote, "My father served in 2 wars. He said that 10 minutes healed something in him that 20 years of noise couldn't." In school, students were asked to write what the moment meant. One wrote, "She didn't talk over them. She didn't let them talk over her. She just waited, and that made them listen." Another wrote, "She made me believe I can be strong without shouting." And in homes across the country, something subtle began to change. Dinner tables became less about yelling opinions and more about asking questions. Grandparents told stories they hadn't told in decades. Teenagers left their phones off during conversations. People started ending arguments with, "Let me think about that," instead of trying to win. Not everywhere, not always, but in enough homes that something shifted. And still, Jasmine said nothing. Because she didn't need to. History usually remembers the loud, the speeches that echo, the protests that roar, the revolutions that shake cities. But every once in a while, something else leaves a mark, something that doesn't shout, but stays. Jasmine Crockett never asked for a legacy. She never asked to be remembered, and yet, what she left behind moved like a whisper across a generation. Not to change the world in one stroke, but to remind it, softly, that sometimes the loudest kind of strength is the kind that chooses to stay still. She didn't ride the wave of attention. She didn't trademark her silence or build a brand around her beliefs. There were no books, no podcasts, no documentaries with her voice narrating the arc. She turned them all down. Not out of defiance, but because the moment had already said everything she needed to say. "Let the world breathe it in," she reportedly told a close colleague. "Don't bottle it. Let it live on its own." She returned to work, quietly, consistently. The cameras tried to follow her, but she gave them nothing new to spin. Her routine didn't change. She showed up at the Capitol, sat in on committee hearings, met with constituents behind closed doors, walked hallways most people never see. And while the spotlight chased her, she walked right past it, never once breaking stride, never once reaching for the mic. But what Jasmine didn't chase, others carried. Across the country, small moments began to bear her fingerprints. Not branded, not labeled, just echoed. In a community center in Philadelphia, a group of teenage girls formed a discussion circle called the Still Space, where the rule was simple: you weren't allowed to interrupt, even if you disagreed. The motto printed on the wall came from Jasmine's interview: "I pray not to become an enemy to myself." In a high school in Montana, a debate team added a new category called silent position, where one student could choose to make their argument through stillness alone. The judges admitted sometimes it was the most persuasive stance in the room. One church in Atlanta removed their pulpit and replaced it with a single wooden chair, a quiet tribute. "We're not here to perform," the pastor said. "We're here to be present." At a veterans center in Arizona, counselors began offering 10 seconds of silence before every group meeting. Not for prayer, unless someone wanted it, just for breath, for dignity, for grounding. And they called it, with no irony, the Jasmine Pause. The effect was never flashy, never headline-worthy, but it was everywhere. Hospitals adopted it, judges cited it, teachers taught it. In one courtroom in Minnesota, a female public defender wrote, "Stillness is power" on her legal pad before every trial. Not to inspire her clients, but to steady herself. And in doing so, she won more than she lost. Years later, a school in Ohio launched a writing competition titled A Legacy in Quiet. Middle school students were asked to write essays about a moment in their lives when silence changed everything. Hundreds of entries poured in. A 12-year-old boy wrote about not hitting back during a fight because he remembered Jasmine's calm. A girl wrote about watching her mother cry and deciding to hold her hand instead of asking questions. One student said, "The world tells us to talk louder, but maybe what it needs is more people who know when not to." Still, Jasmine said nothing. And yet, everywhere, people spoke of her, not with celebrity adoration, not with political praise, but with a kind of quiet reverence usually reserved for stories passed down between generations. She had become not just a memory, but a measure, a standard for what strength could look like when it wasn't about dominance. Some tried to claim her. Political parties tried to fold her into their narratives. Networks offered her exclusive segments. Even movements began to chant her name. But she never showed, never signed, never raised a flag. And that frustrated some. But deep down, it's what kept her legacy intact. Because what Jasmine gave the world couldn't be owned. It could only be understood. A historian wrote, "Most legacies are carved in law, or power, or loss. Hers was carved in restraint." A theologian wrote, "Jasmine taught us that holiness isn't always fire. Sometimes it's still water." And a teenage girl in Milwaukee simply posted a selfie wearing a cross her grandmother had given her with the caption, "Thanks for reminding me this doesn't have to be trendy to mean something." No monuments were built, no national holidays declared, and yet her image appeared in murals, in essays, in music and poems. A choir in Brooklyn composed a piece called Unshaken, with no lyrics, only harmonies that built from silence. A visual artist created a painting titled 10 Seconds, showing Jasmine seated in a swirl of chaos, but untouched by it. And quietly, something deeper shifted in the way people thought about faith. It wasn't about agreement. It wasn't about conversion. But the culture that once mocked belief, rolled its eyes at prayer, scoffed at spiritual symbols, began to pause. Not everywhere, but in enough places to notice. It became harder to mock what someone held sacred without remembering her face, her posture, her voice when she said, "I don't pray to win. I pray not to become an enemy to myself." That sentence didn't demand respect. It commanded it. And for many who had once buried their faith out of fear or fatigue, Jasmine's moment gave them permission, not to preach, but to believe without apology. She didn't need to evangelize. She embodied. And slowly, generation by generation, her name was passed not like a headline, but like a parable. The woman who held her ground when the world tried to make her break. The woman who answered cruelty with calm. The woman who didn't try to win the debate, because she was playing a different game altogether. Years later, when a reporter asked a young congressional intern if she wanted to be famous, she said, "No, I want to be like Jasmine. I want to stand, even if no one claps." In the end, her legacy wasn't a movement. It was a memory, a choice, a standard, and the simple eternal truth that the soul of a person, and maybe even a nation, can still be moved not by the loudest voice in the room, but by the one who refuses to raise it at all. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference. What happens when a rural hospital shuts down and your mom has a stroke 47 miles from help? Jasmine Crockett walked into Congress and said what millions were too afraid to. People are dying while you fund fences. In just 5 minutes, she dismantled Marjorie Taylor Greene's attack on public health funding. The fallout? Greene went silent, and Crockett's words sparked a nationwide movement. But what exactly did she say that shook the entire room to its core? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The hearing room was cold and sterile, lit by harsh fluorescent lights that drained color from the wood-paneled walls. Leather chairs lined the U-shaped desk, slowly filling with lawmakers in dark suits and tighter expressions. Flags stood stiff behind the podium. Red timers blinked down the seconds. Aides whispered, papers shuffled. No one smiled. The air felt heavy, like a storm about to break. On the live feed, budget oversight hearing, federal health funding. To most, just politics. But in the room, tension cracked like a silent match. Jasmine Crockett sat still, pen moving fast across a notebook. A former Dallas prosecutor, now congresswoman, she was calm, unreadable, watching, not performing. No makeup for cameras, no flair, just a sharp navy suit in sharper silence. She didn't posture, she prepared. Then came Marjorie Taylor Greene, heels loud, folder thick, blazer red. Her entrance was deliberate. She thrived on spectacle. She flipped open her binder like a weapon, filled with screenshots and accusations. No hesitation, no filter. One glance at Crockett, a smirk. In her mind, she was already winning. She had no idea what was coming. Then, without waiting for a cue or glance from the chair, Marjorie Taylor Greene leaned forward and pressed the button on her microphone with a snap. The sound clicked through the room like a starting gun. She didn't clear her throat. She didn't need to. "Let's just be honest here," she said, voice steady but edged with steel. "This hearing, it's not really about helping people. It's about where we're putting our money. And right now, it's going to all the wrong places." She flipped open her binder, turning to a page marked in red, and held up a photo. It showed a mobile health van parked outside a grocery store, a small line of patients waiting outside in lawn chairs. "We're spending millions on this," she said. "Free clinics driving around the country, handing out medicine, treating people who don't even pay into the system. This is what we call healthcare now?" She slapped the photo down on the desk and leaned back just slightly, shoulders squared. "I'm sorry, but this isn't sustainable. It's not even smart. We're pouring billions into programs that don't fix anything. They just keep people dependent. That's not solving a problem. That's making sure it never goes away." She paused in scanning the room. "Meanwhile, our border is wide open. We've got drug cartels walking across with backpacks full of fentanyl, human traffickers, illegal crossings, crime. And instead of dealing with that, we're funding another mobile clinic in Oregon? That doesn't make sense. It's backwards." Now her voice started to rise, not in anger, but with the rhythm of someone hitting a practiced beat. "Here's my proposal. Let's move $3 billion out of these health programs and put it into the southern border, into people and technology that can actually stop threats. I'm talking about boots on the ground, cameras, barriers, real solutions." She looked down, tapped the folder twice. "Because honestly, I'd rather stop a drug runner at the border than pay for a free flu shot at some church in Wisconsin." A low murmur stirred behind her, but she didn't flinch. She welcomed it. "And before anyone says I don't care, this isn't about not caring. It's about being smart with the money we've got. Every dollar should go to protecting American families. And right now, that means securing the border." She turned again, locking eyes with Jasmine Crockett, just long enough to let it linger. "I know some of you are going to say I'm being heartless. But let me ask you, when did expecting people to follow the rules become a bad thing? When did protecting our country turn into something we have to apologize for?" She picked up her papers, folded them slowly, precisely. "I'm not going to apologize for wanting order. And if it's a choice between another free clinic or stopping the next truckload of fentanyl, yeah, I choose the border." She set the folder down, folded her hands, and leaned back in her chair. No smile, just calm, hard certainty. She'd made her point, and now she was waiting, watching to see who'd push back first. And just when the room began to settle, Greene made her next move, the kind you don't walk back from. She reached into her folder, pulled out a small remote, and clicked it toward the screen behind her. A video flickered to life. No graphics, no music, just raw cell phone footage. Shaky, grainy, unpolished. A mobile health van parked outside a food bank in rural Alabama. Volunteers moved briskly between dusty cars, handing out brown paper bags and bottles of water. Mothers bounced toddlers on tired hips. Elderly men leaned on walkers. A teenage boy with a bandage on his arm stood with his eyes fixed forward. Beneath a makeshift canopy, "Community Health Outreach, free today." The line stretched around the block. Some people with umbrellas, others just sweating quietly under the southern sun. The room stayed silent, not out of respect, out of tension. Everyone was waiting to see where this was going. Greene's voice sliced through the stillness. "This is what we're funding," she said, slow and sharp. "Vans driving around like the ice cream man, handing out medication like Halloween candy. No insurance, no ID, no questions. Just show up and get your gift bag." She clicked the remote again. The video froze. A volunteer handed a brown bag to a man in a faded t-shirt and a half-shaven beard. "You call that care?" she asked. "Because to me, it looks like a government-sponsored giveaway." Her voice wasn't angry. It was colder than that, clinical, like she was reading a diagnosis and wanted the room to absorb every word. These aren't emergency rooms. They're handout stations. And no one is talking about the cost. She didn't pause to let that sink in. She doubled down, reached into her folder again, held up a sheet of paper. Here's what we found. Case number 1. Male, 38, no job, hasn't filed taxes in 5 years. Walks in, gets free insulin, no paperwork. Says he's between jobs. Been between jobs since 2019. Case number 2. Female, 24, healthy. Gets anxiety meds and birth control because she's stressed about student loans. She looked around the room, a practiced disgust curling in her tone. This is what we call medical necessity now? The room was dead still. So still you could hear the hum of the lights above. Green leaned forward, both palms flat on the table now. Let me be clear. This isn't about trauma. This isn't about heart attacks in parking lots. This is about comfort, convenience, about building a culture where people are taught not to try. Just show up and Uncle Sam will make it better. She pointed at the frozen frame behind her. That bag he's holding? That's not medicine. That's a message. It says, you don't have to take responsibility. We'll do it for you. That's not policy. That's surrender. She adjusted her seat but didn't break eye contact with the room. And before you say, well, isn't that compassion? Let me ask you, what's more compassionate? Giving someone a pill or giving them a reason to get back up? Teaching people to stand, earn, contribute? Because this, she pointed again, stabbing at the air, this is dependence wrapped in ribbon and called kindness. The final sheet came down like a closing book, folded carefully, deliberately. Then she looked up, not at the committee, not at the chair, but into the camera lens, straight through it. This is your money, she said to the viewers at home. Every prescription, every gallon of gas for those vans, every clipboard, it came from your paycheck. And these programs, they want more, billions more. Then with a voice like a verdict, you call it community health. I call it political charity. The kind that keeps people down and calls it help. And I, for one, am tired of paying for it. She let it sit. Then she turned, not to numbers, not to policy, but to the one person who hadn't said a single word. Jasmine Crockett. She didn't say her name. She didn't need to. Her eyes drifted down the row. Found her. Crockett, still writing, still silent. A slow smile crept across Green's face. Not warm, not amused. It was the smile of someone convinced they'd already won. I imagine some of my colleagues across the aisle, she began, drawing the words out like a dare, will try to tug at your heartstrings today. Her eyes narrowed on Crockett. Maybe talk about fairness, or feelings, or someone who cried because they couldn't afford a prescription. She dropped her voice, let it sink. I don't do feelings, she said flatly. I do facts. I do numbers. I do national security. Green leaned back in her chair just slightly, but her posture was anything but relaxed. She was coiled, ready, expecting. Because while you're hearing about pain and moral obligation, I want you to remember this. None of that stops fentanyl. None of that secures a border. None of that fixes what's broken. The chairwoman shifted, sensing the tension cresting, but Green pushed once more. Lower now, like a knife sliding under skin. I'm sure Congresswoman Crockett has a few stories prepared, she said, tilting her head. She's probably writing one now. Laughter, low and tight, rippled from her side of the aisle. Green gave a knowing nod toward the pen in Crockett's hand. She's always writing, always waiting. A pause, then, but the country's not waiting. The country's bleeding. Crockett didn't look up. Not yet, but something had changed. A stillness in the air, a shift in gravity. Her shoulders straightened. Her hand paused. Then calmly, without flinching, she turned the page. But Crockett wasn't listening to Green anymore. Not really. Her body was still there, pen in hand, but her mind had already left the room. She was somewhere else entirely, back in a place Green had never been, a place no chart could measure, a place no insult could reach. The air in the hearing room faded, replaced by thick summer heat and the low whir of a ceiling fan that did little more than stir the dust. She was 9. Her mother had collapsed on the porch of their rural Texas home, halfway between breathing and silence. No neighbors close enough to hear her fall, no ambulance nearby. The closest clinic was 50 miles out, down a cracked 2-lane road with more cattle than cars. Her uncle drove like his hands were fire, but they still arrived too late to stop the seizure. Not fatal, not that time, but it carved a line in Jasmine's life she never forgot, a line between who gets help and who gets left behind. She remembered watching the nurses scramble, remembered the hum of fluorescent lights above her mother's hospital bed, remembered the words whispered when they thought she couldn't hear. If they'd gotten here just 10 minutes sooner, that sentence became a scar. Not the visible kind. The kind that makes you sit straighter in hearings like this, that keeps your hands steady when someone mocks a mobile clinic. That's why she never interrupts. Why she listens before she speaks. Because she knows what happens when no one listens at all. Jasmine's fingers tightened just slightly around her pen, knuckles whitening for half a second before loosening again. She was still writing. Facts, dates, quotes. But behind every number was a name. Behind every line of data, a life like her mother's. She knew Green hadn't lived that silence, hadn't stood in a patch of dirt wondering if help would come, before the last breath did. That's why she didn't flinch when Green called it a gift bag. Because Jasmine had once prayed for a gift like that. Any bag, any van, any nurse with a blood pressure cuff. She wasn't ashamed of it. She remembered what desperation looked like. And she had promised herself, long before she stepped into politics, that no one else would feel that alone on her watch. So when Jasmine Crockett finally leaned into her microphone, she didn't raise her voice. She raised the stakes. Her tone was calm, but there was something beneath it, steel wrapped in velvet. She didn't adjust her seat or flip her hair. She didn't even look at Green right away. Instead, she looked at the chairwoman, then down at her notes, then slowly lifted her eyes toward the room. "Congresswoman Green," she said, her voice even but heavy with purpose. "Have you ever ridden in the back of an ambulance for 40 minutes while someone you love was slipping away?" Her words cut through the quiet like glass. Not for a photo op, not for a talking point. I mean, really been there. Middle of the night. No sirens loud enough. Just you, the driver, and a growing fear that you're too far from help. She paused, but not to let the silence speak for her. She paused to let the truth breathe. "I have," she continued, softer now but no less clear. "I was 9 years old. My mother collapsed on our front porch. There wasn't a hospital in our town anymore. They'd shut it down the year before. Budget cuts, staffing shortages. We had no choice but to wait. No paramedics, no urgent care. Just my uncle driving 80 miles an hour down back roads in a pickup truck, hoping we could get to someone, anyone, before it was too late." She took a breath, and for a moment the room felt like it had lost oxygen. "We made it, but barely. I still remember the nurse whispering to another, 10 more minutes and she wouldn't have made it. You don't forget that, not ever." Her fingers didn't shake, her posture didn't shift, but the room had. Lawmakers who had been looking at their phones were now watching her hands, her face, the way her voice didn't crack even though her words did. "So when I hear talk about reallocating billions of dollars away from healthcare," she said, her eyes now locking on Green, "I don't hear strategy. I hear warning signs. I see mothers collapsing on porches with no one coming. I see what happens when we decide some lives are just too far away to care about." She turned back to her notes, not for drama, but for evidence, for reality. "Let's talk about Newton County, Missouri," she said, flipping to the first page. "Hospital shut down last October. The closest ER is now 47 miles away. There's one clinic left, one nurse. They're open Tuesdays and Thursdays, noon to 5. That's it. No overnight care, no emergency response, no ambulance that gets there in time." She looked around the room. "And you want to tell me that money would be better spent on more fences? On more walls? Let me ask you something. What does a wall do for someone having a stroke in the middle of the woods?" Green shifted in her chair. The room felt tighter, smaller. Tension was building, but Crockett didn't let it break. She kept her voice level, her tone surgical. "You keep saying this isn't personal, that it's just numbers, just dollars and cents. But for people like me, for where I come from, these aren't statistics. These are stories written in pain, in funerals, in unanswered 911 calls. She paused again. The silence wasn't awkward now. It was earned. It held weight. Then Green snapped. "I didn't come here to listen to stories," she barked, hands slicing through the air. "I came to talk about facts, not someone's personal sob story." Her voice was sharper than it had been all morning, louder, a little desperate. But Crockett didn't blink. She didn't flinch. She turned her head slowly, looked Green in the eye, and replied in the same voice she'd used all along, measured, unshaken. "You call it a sob story," she said. "I call it Tuesday night in my district." The words landed like thunder without thunder. No shouting, no bravado, just truth. She returned to her notes calmly, as if the room hadn't just been flipped inside out. Because in that moment, Crockett wasn't arguing. She was reminding them, reminding all of them, what they'd come here to pretend didn't exist. But Crockett wasn't finished, because personal stories were only part of the truth. The rest came from facts. Real ones. The kind printed on government letterhead. The kind backed by data and lives. She flipped calmly through the tabs in her binder, stopping at a worn page she'd marked days ago. "Let's talk about what we're spending money on," she began, her voice steady but firm. "Right now, there's a push for $12 billion to build more walls, buy more border drones, and hand out new contracts for surveillance tech. $12 billion. And we're being told that's necessary, urgent." She paused, then looked straight across the aisle. "But when we asked for $300 million to keep dozens of small-town hospitals open last year, we were told no, that it wasn't in the budget, that maybe we could try again next cycle." She shook her head, not in anger, but in disbelief. "So let me ask, how does that make sense? We can spend $12 billion to keep people out, but we can't spend $300 million to keep people alive." She flipped to the next page and held up a single highlighted line. "In Newton County, Missouri, their only hospital closed last fall. No ER, no maternity ward, just gone. Now the closest emergency care is 47 miles away. That's almost an hour, if the roads are clear." She let the silence hang for a beat. "And it's not just Missouri. It's happening all over. Rural hospitals are shutting down because we keep choosing other priorities. And people are dying because of it." She pointed down at the page. "The CDC says when a rural hospital closes, the death rate in that area can go up by nearly 30%. That's not a theory. That's not politics. That's people." She turned to a second report, this one thinner but heavier in meaning. "FEMA now says that not having local health care is a national risk, same level as a power grid failing or a cyber attack. Why? Because when disasters hit small towns with no doctors, no nurses, and no ambulances, we lose people fast. Not because they did something wrong, but because no one planned to protect them." Her voice dropped slightly, not to soften the blow, but to sharpen it. "You keep talking about the border," she said, eyes still on Green. "But what about the people who are already here? What about the dad in Arkansas who dies of a stroke because it took an hour for the ambulance to reach him? What about the mom in Mississippi who tries to make her insulin last 6 extra days because she can't afford to refill it yet? What about the kid with asthma in rural Texas who hasn't seen a real doctor in over a year?" She wasn't performing, she was testifying. "You say this is about keeping people safe," Crockett said, leaning forward slightly. "Well, my idea of safety is making sure a sick child can get to a clinic before it's too late. It's making sure a pregnant woman doesn't have to drive 2 hours just to give birth. It's making sure a 70-year-old veteran doesn't die alone in his trailer because we decided we'd rather buy more motion sensors than pay for a nurse to staff a clinic." Her eyes didn't blink. Her voice didn't shake. "We have the money. We just don't want to spend it on the people who need it most. And that's not about national security. That's about national neglect." The room was frozen, but she wasn't done. "If we can find $12 billion for walls, we can find $300 million for hospitals. If we say we can't, then we've made a decision, one we should admit out loud, that we care more about guarding lines on a map than we do about keeping people breathing inside them." And then she finished with one sentence, quiet but impossible to ignore. "This isn't about immigration. It's about abandonment. And if we keep calling that a policy choice, then we've already decided who gets left behind. But powerful words don't just land, they leave bruises. And as Jasmine Crockett's final sentence echoed through the room, not with force but with calm precision, every eye turned. Not to her, but to the other side of the dais, to Marjorie Taylor Greene. The woman who had started the morning with swagger in her step and fire on her tongue now sat stiff in her chair, her expression caught between forced poise and something quieter, uncertainty. It was subtle at first. Her jaw shifted, then reset. She tried to smirk, the kind she usually wore when she knew the cameras were watching, but this one didn't stick. Her lips moved into a half smile, too fast, too shallow. "You're making it dramatic," she said finally, voice a notch higher than before. "This isn't Broadway, it's Congress." She laughed, just once. It came out dry. No one laughed with her. She reached for her notes, flipping a page that didn't need flipping. Her fingers hesitated on the paper, like they weren't sure what they were looking for. The numbers, the talking points, the punchlines, they were there, but they weren't landing anymore. Not after what Crockett had just laid down. Not after $12 billion was put side by side with insulin, birth, and death. Greene's hand moved to her water bottle. She twisted the cap too hard. It squeaked. She set it down, tapped the table once, then again, then again. Not rhythmic, not controlled, just nervous energy with nowhere to go. Across the committee table, no one said anything. Not Crockett, not the chairwoman, not even Greene's usual allies. For the first time, the room wasn't reacting to what Greene said. It was reacting to what she didn't say. Her silence spoke louder than her words had all morning. She was staring forward now, but not at anyone in particular. Not like before, when every glance was a calculated jab. Now she was avoiding eye contact, especially with Crockett. Crockett hadn't moved. She hadn't smiled. She hadn't even uncrossed her hands. She didn't have to. She didn't need to lean forward or speak again. She had already done what needed doing, and Greene knew it. Everyone knew it. There was no applause, no outburst, just the quiet, undeniable feeling of a shift. One of those rare moments in Washington where the room itself knows something real just happened. Greene adjusted her jacket sleeve like it itched. She looked down again at her binder, still not reading, just looking, as if the numbers could protect her now. But the tone had changed. Her voice, just minutes earlier, so sharp, so sure, now carried a small edge of defense. "You're turning this into something it's not," she muttered. Not loud enough to reset the room, but just loud enough to fill the silence. "You're playing to emotion. I'm trying to talk facts." But her own voice betrayed her. The confidence was gone. What was left was posture without power. She wasn't debating anymore. She was reacting. And for anyone watching closely, staffers, aides, even the journalists in the back, it was clear. This was the moment the momentum left her side. Not because she had been shouted down, not because someone raised their voice louder than hers, but because someone had the truth and delivered it so plainly that no defense felt real afterward. Greene didn't crumble. She didn't storm out. That wasn't her style. But her hand tapping the desk didn't stop. Her eyes kept drifting away from Crockett. Her laugh, the one that used to rattle a room, had lost its timing. And for the first time all morning, she looked like someone trying to hold on to something that had already slipped through her fingers. And just when it seemed Greene might regain her footing, when she reached for her binder, tapped her notes, adjusted her sleeve like she still had control, Crockett looked up and quietly stripped that illusion away. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't move. Her posture was still, her expression steady. But the question she asked next cut through every talking point in the room. "Congresswoman," she began, with a tone so calm it somehow felt louder than Greene's strongest shout, "if your mother lived in a small town in Kansas and she got sick in the middle of the night and the roads were closed because of a flood and the only place giving real-time updates on where the rescue routes were was a public radio station, would you still call that a waste of money?" She let it hang. No rush. No rush was needed. The room froze. No one shifted. No one whispered. Even the reporters stopped typing. The hum of the overhead lights suddenly felt louder, like the only sound left in the entire building. Everyone waited, not because they expected a brilliant response, but because they knew something just changed. Because Crockett hadn't just asked a political question, she'd asked a human one. And now Marjorie Taylor Greene, the woman who had spoken all morning about waste and dependency and real Americans, was on the receiving end of it. Crockett didn't blink. "I want to know," she continued, "would you still call that funding unnecessary? Would you still say public radio is political theater if the only voice your mother could hear in the dark was telling her which road could save her life?" Across the room, Greene shifted. Not confidently, not like before. This wasn't the movement of someone standing their ground. It was the movement of someone suddenly unsure where the ground was. She gave a half laugh, a hollow one, the kind meant to buy time, not land a blow. Her fingers drummed the desk again, but this time it wasn't defiant. It was nervous, restless. She looked up, eyes scanning, but not locking on to anyone. She didn't answer. Instead, she tried to smile. Just barely. A weak twitch at the corners of her mouth, the same look someone wears when they know a camera is still rolling, but the words are gone. "You're twisting it," she mumbled. "You're making it emotional." But Crockett didn't react. She didn't pounce. She just let the weight of the silence return. Because that was the truth. Greene couldn't answer. Not really. Because to answer truthfully would mean admitting that, yes, even she might one day rely on the very system she had spent hours trying to tear down. That her own family in the wrong place, at the wrong time, could be the next to need that wasteful emergency broadcast. That the idea of handouts gets real quiet when it's your mother on the line. The cameras were still rolling, but Greene no longer seemed to care about the angles. She didn't push back. She didn't redirect. She didn't fire another accusation. She simply went quiet, eyes cast down, hands still, face unreadable, not because she had won, but because, in that moment, everyone in the room knew she had nothing left to say. And in that stillness, Crockett didn't gloat. She didn't look smug. She didn't move at all. Because that silence, that was her answer. And it was louder than anything else said that day. And in that silence, something even more unexpected happened. Not a cheer, not a speech, not a dramatic reaction, but a small, quiet shift in the room's balance. Congressman David Keller, a long-serving Republican from Wyoming, sat near the middle of the dais. He wasn't loud, never had been. He didn't court headlines, didn't post clips on Twitter, didn't wear party allegiance like a brand. He was old school, a former rancher turned public servant, known more for his calm than his commentary. He hadn't said a word all morning. Not when Greene launched her first attack. Not when the hearing turned sharp. He just sat there listening, watching, taking it all in. But now as Crockett's words settled over the chamber like dust in a quiet field, "There is no policy more important than a human life." Something in his face changed, just slightly. His brow softened. His eyes, weathered and heavy-lidded, lifted from his notes and landed on her. Not with judgment, not with curiosity, but with recognition. There was a pause. Then very slowly, he gave a single nod. Not big, not dramatic, not the kind that demanded cameras. It was the kind of nod a man gives when someone else says what he's been thinking for years, but never said out loud. A nod not of politics, but of truth. He didn't speak. He didn't follow it with a statement. He didn't have to. That one motion said it all. "I hear you, and I believe you." It didn't escape the room. The chairwoman glanced sideways. A Democratic staffer's pen froze mid-scribble. Even a junior Republican aide near the back blinked like he wasn't sure what he'd just witnessed. And across the table, Greene sat rigid, still looking down at her paperwork, still tapping her finger, harder now like she was trying to drown out what she knew had just happened. Because Greene had spoken for almost an hour, and not once had she received that kind of silent agreement. Not from her side, not from any side. But Crockett had. She hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't flinched. She hadn't moved from her seat. And yet somehow she had reached across that wide political divide and pulled one person, one conservative, long respected, slow to react, into the space between right and wrong. Not with theatrics, not with spin, but with the one thing even the most hardened politicians can't ignore: lived truth. And Crockett? She saw the nod. Of course she did. But she didn't react. She didn't smile or acknowledge it or let it change her tone. Because this wasn't about winning a moment. This wasn't a game. That nod wasn't applause, it was witness. It was someone saying, "You're right. Even if I can't say it out loud, you're right." It was small, it was quiet, but it was also irreversible. Something had cracked, and everyone knew it. And while the hearing room stayed frozen in silence, something else had already begun outside. Something faster than any debate, louder than any gavel. Without warning, without plan, the line had slipped through the walls of Congress and landed straight in the bloodstream of the internet. It wasn't a speech. It wasn't a viral stunt. It was just one sentence. Crockett had said it almost in passing, after everything else had been said, almost too quiet to catch. The American people don't need imaginary borders. They need real clinics. But someone had heard it. Someone had clipped it. Someone had posted it. And by the time she closed her binder, it was already spreading like wildfire. The video was short, 12 seconds. No dramatic music, no flashy edits. Just the camera trained on Crockett's face, her voice low and steady, her eyes locked in truth. The line hit different, not because it was clever, but because it was raw. And because people had been waiting for someone, anyone, to say exactly that. Within an hour, the clip had bounced across TikTok, Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. People weren't just watching it. They were stitching it, remixing it, repeating it. Someone layered it over photos of shuttered hospitals in Arkansas and empty pharmacy shelves in Nebraska. Another stitched it beside footage of mothers in rural Alabama standing in line at mobile clinics. Someone else set it to a simple piano track, slowed it down, and played it over flashing images of emergency rooms closing one after another across red state counties. The comment sections didn't argue. They confessed. "This is my hometown. We lost our hospital in 2019 and haven't had prenatal care since. My dad had a stroke and we had to drive 90 miles. He didn't make it." A teacher in Kansas filmed her own reaction, holding up the video as tears filled her eyes. This is what we've been trying to say. Not left or right, just real. We're dying out here and nobody's listening. Then the remixes came. One was simple. Crockett's voice, slowed and looped over a beat, her line repeating like a mantra. Real clinics, not walls. Real lives, not lines. It played over drone footage of small towns, gas stations, trailers, long highways with no hospitals in sight. It wasn't flashy. It was quiet. And because of that, it hit harder than anything loud ever could. Teenagers shared it from school libraries. Nurses blasted it on Bluetooth speakers behind clinic desks. A combat vet reposted it with the caption, "I fought overseas. I came home and couldn't get a blood pressure check for 6 weeks." This woman is telling the truth. Local news caught it first, then regional, then national. But the viral moment wasn't about fame. It wasn't about going big. It was about going deep. It was about reaching places that DC rarely thinks about. It was about someone finally saying the quiet part out loud, that we've spent too long pretending concrete and cameras keep us safer than care. That policy without compassion leaves people to die quietly, out of frame. That lives don't stop mattering when they live in towns with no lobbyists. Crockett didn't post it. She didn't promote it. She didn't have to. The country did it for her, because in that moment, millions of Americans weren't watching a politician. They were hearing someone finally speak like a neighbor, and they were ready to pass it on. But while Crockett's words moved across the country like a quiet revolution, Marjorie Taylor Greene's silence began to grow roots. At first, it looked like nothing. Just a skipped interview, a rescheduled press briefing, a vague excuse about travel demands. But those who had followed her for years could tell the difference. She wasn't avoiding the media. She was avoiding the moment. The moment when people would look her in the eye and repeat the one sentence she had no answer for. The people don't need imaginary borders. They need real clinics. It was showing up everywhere now, on handmade signs, on bumper stickers, on the backs of protest t-shirts outside her next event, which she canceled 2 hours before go time, without explanation. Her staff scrambled. They circulated new memos. They reworded her statements, but they couldn't rewrite what had already happened. She hadn't lost an argument. She had lost a room and the internet. She still walked the Capitol halls, still kept her head high in public, but her pace had changed. She didn't linger for cameras. She ducked them. She didn't meet reporters' eyes. She waved them off with one-word replies, always in motion. The fire was still there, maybe, but it flickered. The spark she used to weaponize had dimmed, not from embarrassment, but from something harder to spin: exposure. People weren't reacting to her fury anymore. They were noticing its emptiness, because for once, she'd been met not with a louder voice, but with a quieter truth, and it stuck. Meanwhile, on the other side of the building, in a modest office with one staffer and two chairs that didn't match, Jasmine Crockett sat quietly as her email filled up by the minute. Not from donors, not from party leaders, but from people. Regular people. The kind who didn't usually write to Washington. Farmers, veterans, teachers, single mothers, grocery clerks. Some of them typed like they were out of practice. Some apologized for bad grammar. Some just wrote one sentence. You said what needed to be said. I watched it 3 times. You reminded me of my grandmother. But again and again, the phrase that kept returning: thank you for not being afraid. She read every single one, sometimes at her desk, sometimes sitting on the floor with her shoes off, too tired to move, sometimes with the lights off, lit only by the glow of her laptop. She didn't reply to most. She couldn't. There were too many. But she remembered the names, remembered the small towns, remembered the stories that sounded like her own. And for every letter that said, I've never written a politician before, she felt the same pull in her chest, a mix of sorrow and fire. Sorrow that they had been forgotten for so long. Fire that they had found her now. She hadn't asked for that spotlight. She didn't chase it. But the words had come from somewhere honest. Not from strategy, not from spin. From the part of her that still remembered the backseat of that old car, driving her mother through back roads, praying help was still ahead. And now that memory had traveled, passed through microphones, through glass screens, through state lines, and landed in people who had been waiting for someone to speak their pain out loud. They weren't writing to a politician. They were writing to someone they recognized. And Crockett didn't take it as praise. She took it as a promise. And far from Washington, where the noise fades and fields stretch for miles, one old man sat on his porch with a radio humming beside him and heard something he'd been waiting decades to hear. And far from Washington, where the noise fades and fields stretch for miles, one old man sat on his porch with a radio humming beside him and heard something he'd been waiting decades to hear. The early morning light in rural Nebraska spilled across acres of frost-hardened dirt, the kind of land you work whether or not anyone notices. William Harlow had worked it for 72 years, 3 sons, 1 tractor, a radio that never left his side. He didn't trust screens, didn't care for speeches, and hadn't believed a word out of Washington in a long, long time. But that morning, as he sat in his coat with a mug of black coffee and the soft crackle of NPR rolling through the air, he paused, mid-sip. The voice wasn't loud, wasn't angry, but it was firm, clear, director. The people don't need imaginary borders. They need real clinics. That line played once, then again, in a clip rebroadcast between segments. Harlow didn't say a word. He just stared out past the barn, where the wind pushed against the dry stalks like waves across land. After a long moment, he muttered, almost to himself, "That girl, she's not just arguing. She's speaking for us." He didn't mean Democrats. He didn't mean activists. He meant people like him. People who buried wives without paramedics. People who drove themselves to ERs with chest pain and dirt under their nails. People who paid taxes but hadn't seen a real doctor in years because the nearest clinic had closed and the pharmacy shut down the same winter the highway cracked open and never got fixed. He meant the forgotten, not by accident, but by design. And this girl, this congresswoman he'd never heard of before, was saying it out loud. She gets it, he added, this time with more weight. She's seen it, lived it, ain't just talking through her teeth. He didn't stand up, didn't turn the volume up. He didn't need to. The voice had already gotten through, over static, over distance, over years of silence. And sitting right there in a wooden chair he built himself, William Harlow smiled for the first time in a long while during a broadcast from D.C. because someone had finally remembered him. Across the country, far from the capital, something strange was happening. Not loud, not sudden, but real. People were listening, not just watching a clip, not just sharing it, but really listening. It started slowly, almost like a whisper. One town, one voice, one screen at a time. Then it spread, in living rooms, break rooms, classrooms, and trucks. Not because someone told them to pay attention, but because someone finally said something that sounded like it was meant for them. In a civics class in rural Tennessee, a teacher named Ms. Danner paused the day's lesson halfway through. She had planned to explain the budget process using a dry diagram and a YouTube animation. But something had shifted since the hearing clip started circulating. She opened her laptop, clicked play, and let her students hear the voice of Representative Jasmine Crockett. The classroom, usually fidgety and half distracted, grew still. Kids who rarely stayed off their phones now leaned on their desks, listening. She didn't tell them what to think. She just let the clip run. The people don't need imaginary borders. They need real clinics. No one spoke right away. Then a voice from the back, Jamal, who hadn't said 10 words all semester, raised his hand. "Why don't more people talk like that?" he asked. "Like, actually talk?" Ms. Danner didn't answer right away. She just looked at him and said softly, "Good question." In a small church outside Flagstaff, Arizona, Pastor Ruben Martinez played the audio from his iPhone through a dusty speaker before Sunday service. He didn't say who was speaking. He didn't call it politics. He just let the line hang in the air as families filed in. He watched as people paused mid-step. A mother stopped her daughter from running up the aisle. An older couple in the third pew turned to each other. When the service began, Ruben didn't reference the speaker by name. He just said, "Sometimes the truth doesn't need a pulpit. It just needs to be said." And his congregation nodded in quiet agreement. In Detroit, a bus driver named Alicia replayed the clip on her lunch break, again and again. She didn't know who Crockett was, but the way she said it, not yelling, not preaching, just saying it plain, felt like something Alicia had been trying to explain to her union rep for 5 years. She sent the video to her sister, a nurse in Lansing, who called her back 20 minutes later in tears. "This is what it's like every day," she said. Every damn day in a hospital hallway in Charleston, West Virginia. A third-year nurse named Carly watched the clip with her back against the wall, scrolling through the flood of reactions. Her shift had started at 5 a.m. She hadn't had a break in 4 hours. The clinic was short 3 people. The waiting room was full. She was tired, not just physically, but spiritually. But hearing Crockett speak, hearing someone in power talk about clinics like they mattered, felt like someone had finally noticed. Not the hospital administrators, not the donors, not the board. Someone who'd sat in the waiting room too. She sent the clip to every nurse in her unit with a single sentence. "She gets it." In Dallas, a truck driver named Jorge sat in his cab on the side of a state highway, engine cooling, radio on low. NPR had just aired a piece about the hearing, followed by a rebroadcast of Crockett's closing remarks. Jorge didn't have time for politics. He didn't trust politicians. But this one sounded different. She didn't sound like she was trying to win. She sounded like she was done watching people lose. He sat with the radio playing long after the story ended. Then he pulled out his phone, opened a messaging app, and typed to his teenage daughter back home. "You need to watch this." She sounds like Abuela used to. In Topeka, Kansas, a grocery store cashier named Marie listened to the clip in the back room while her co-worker took over the register. She watched the video once, then again, then put it on speaker for the others. "This is the lady who shut the other one down," she said, but there was no mockery in her voice, just awe. Her manager, a quiet man named Doug who rarely talked politics, stood behind her and whispered. "She wasn't just speaking. She was testifying." Marie nodded, eyes still on the screen. "Yeah, it felt like church." In rural Montana, a community clinic had the clip playing on loop on a small monitor in the waiting room. Patients watched while filling out paperwork. One woman pulled out her phone and filmed the screen, then turned the camera on herself and said, "I didn't think anyone in DC remembered we existed, but she does." In Baltimore, a group of teenagers in a youth writing workshop played the clip before starting their prompt. "Write what you wish someone would say for you," their instructor told them. One boy raised his hand. "She already did." The room went quiet. It wasn't about a viral video anymore. It was about a feeling, something unspoken finally spoken, a pressure released, a quiet grief recognized. In cafes and classrooms, on dusty roads and subway cars, in barber shops and school parking lots, people listened, and they weren't nodding because it was catchy. They were nodding because it was true, because it said what they had been shouting into the void for years. And slowly, something else started to happen. People who had never sent a letter to a representative started writing. People who hadn't registered to vote in a decade started looking up deadlines. Not because Crockett had told them to, not because she promised them anything, but because someone had stood in the place where truth is usually filtered out and refused to let it be silenced. The building was nearly empty. Outside the windows, the Capitol dome glowed faintly in the dark, like a lighthouse with no ocean. Washington had gone quiet, at least on the surface. The suits, the lights, the microphones, all packed up hours ago. But inside a second-floor office tucked into a narrow hallway of the Rayburn building, the light was still on. Jasmine Crockett sat behind her desk, jacket off, tie loosened, flats kicked to the side. The soft yellow glow of a desk lamp lit the room. The overhead fluorescence stayed off. It was the kind of light you sit with, not work under. Her phone buzzed every few seconds. A vibration, a new email, a news alert, a DM. She didn't check them. Not right away, not tonight. The adrenaline had faded. The anger too. What was left wasn't pride, and it wasn't relief. It was weight. Not the kind you carry in your arms. The kind that settles behind your ribs. The kind that makes silence feel louder than applause. On her desk, a stack of printed emails sat neatly beside her notepad. She had started printing them out earlier that evening. Not because she needed to, but because she wanted to hold them, to feel the weight of the words in her hands. Every one of them had come in over the last 24 hours. Not from donors, not from campaign managers, from people, real people. She reached for the one on top. "Congresswoman Crockett, I don't know if this will ever reach you, but I just watched the hearing. I'm 67. I've never written to a politician before. But when you said we don't need imaginary borders, we need real clinics," I cried. "I'm not embarrassed to admit that. I cried because someone finally said what we've been living through. Thank you. Thank you for not being afraid to tell the truth. You weren't just speaking, you were standing up for us. God bless you. Ruth M., Arkansas." Jasmine read it once, then again, then folded it carefully and placed it in a separate pile. Her eyes were tired but not heavy. She wasn't crying, but the corners stung a little. The silence in the room wasn't empty. It was full, full of faces she hadn't met. Stories she hadn't lived but recognized anyway. Not because they were hers, but because they could have been. That was the hardest part. She picked up another letter. "I'm a nurse in Oklahoma. Our clinic serves 4 counties, 2 nurses, no backup, no overnight staff. People think we're exaggerating when we say we're all they've got. But we are. When you spoke at the hearing, I felt seen. And I didn't expect that. Not from DC, not from anyone. Please don't stop, even when they talk over you, even when they try to twist your words. Please don't stop." She leaned back in her chair, let the words rest in her hands. The screen of her laptop dimmed on its own. She didn't reach to wake it. It could wait. She thought about her mother, that night on the porch, the sirens that never came, the sound of tires over gravel, the words whispered by nurses when they thought a little girl wasn't listening. 10 minutes later and she wouldn't have made it. She had been chasing those 10 minutes her whole life, her whole career, trying to give them back to someone else. It was never about politics, not really. It was about time, about saving someone else from running out of it. She picked up another letter. This one was handwritten. postmarked from Iowa. You don't know me, but I know people like you. And I've waited a long time to hear one of you in that room say what you said. I'm not a Democrat, never been, probably never will be, but you're the first person who's spoken like someone who's actually sat with a sick parent and waited for help that didn't come. That matters more than party. That's character. And I see it. Just thought you should know. That one hit different, not because it crossed the aisle, but because it crossed something bigger. The space between skepticism and belief. The space where most Americans live. Crockett stood up, walked slowly toward the window. The dome outside still glowed, but it felt far away now, smaller, less powerful than the silence in the room. She pressed her hand against the glass, not hard, just enough to feel the chill. She thought about the day, the sharpness of Green's voice, the stillness when it broke, the look on Keller's face when he nodded from across the aisle. She hadn't set out to make a moment. She hadn't rehearsed that line. They don't need imaginary borders. They need real clinics. It had just come out, like it had been waiting for years in the back of her throat, too heavy to hold any longer. And now it was out there, and people were holding on to it like a lifeline. She turned back to her desk, sat down slowly, took one last email from the pile and opened it. Representative Crockett, I'm 14. My dad works nights. My mom had a seizure last year and we live far from a hospital. We listened to your hearing on the radio. I just wanted to say thank you. I want to be like you one day. Someone who speaks for the people who don't have microphones. Ava, Missouri. That was the one. She sat with it in her lap for a long time. The kind of long that doesn't tick by. The kind you just feel in your chest. She didn't cry, but she breathed differently, heavier, softer, wiser. She looked around the room, the legal pads, the policy books, the clock that hadn't been reset since daylight saving time. She didn't feel victorious. She didn't feel heroic. She just felt responsible. Responsible for what came next, for what she said tomorrow, for who she carried with her into every room, even if they never knew it. The lights outside dimmed a little as the clouds passed. The city was still moving. Cars, headlines, alerts. But for a moment in that room, everything slowed, and she knew, her bones, that this was the cost of truth. Not attention, not applause, but the weight of knowing people believed you and expected you to keep going. And as the dust finally settled, beyond the headlines, the viral clips, the silence, and the fire, what remained wasn't a moment or a win or a viral line. It was a lesson. This wasn't just a story about a debate. It wasn't about a viral soundbite or a political takedown. It was about the quiet war between those who speak loudest and those who speak last. Between what's said for applause and what's said because it's true. It was about Jasmine Crockett sitting in a room that wasn't built for her voice and using it anyway. Not to win, but to witness. And in doing so, she didn't just challenge power. She reminded it what it was for. That public service, stripped of ego and stagecraft, is about seeing people no one else bothers to look at, the overlooked, the overworked, the unheard. And the lesson, the one that echoed long after the microphones clicked off, was this. Truth spoken quietly is still truth. It does not need a podium or perfect lighting. It does not have to shout to be felt. It just has to be said by someone who's lived close enough to the fire to know what burning looks like. And once that truth is spoken, clearly, without flinching, it becomes impossible to ignore. Crockett didn't show up to grandstand. She didn't perform. She didn't try to humiliate anyone. She simply held up a mirror, steady and still, and asked the room to look. And that's the part that scared them. Not her politics, not her tone, but her clarity. Because it's easy to fight someone who yells. It's much harder to argue with someone who simply refuses to lie. She stood for people who rarely get a seat, for patients in shuttered clinics, for mothers who drive past closed emergency rooms, for the kid in the back of the class who thinks no one in DC even knows his town exists. The lesson is this: policy is not abstract. It lives and dies in real places, on real porches, with real consequences. When budgets are cut, it's not numbers that bleed. It's people. And every decision made in rooms like that hearing, every dollar cut or moved or buried in fine print, becomes someone's last ambulance ride, someone's missed warning, someone's story that doesn't get to finish. That's why Crockett didn't blink when Green shouted. That's why she didn't flinch when mocked. Because she wasn't arguing for attention. She was arguing to be remembered. And through her, people who had never been remembered before, farmers, cashiers, nurses, veterans, mothers, caretakers, finally saw someone carry their voices into a place where silence usually wins. And here's what we learned from that. That courage isn't always loud. Sometimes it's someone sitting still while the room gets uncomfortable. That impact isn't always a vote. Sometimes it's a nod from across the aisle or a 3 a.m. letter from someone who thought they didn't matter. That dignity doesn't come from titles. It comes from how you speak when you don't expect to be applauded. The real moral is this. Public service means nothing if it doesn't protect the public's most fragile moments. A country cannot claim to be strong if its people are left gasping in parking lots, if truth is treated like noise, if empathy is seen as weakness. Jasmine Crockett showed us that one voice, steady and unshaken, can stop a room full of shouting, that facts delivered without venom are still facts, that pain, when named, becomes power, and that sometimes the most dangerous thing in politics is a person who tells the truth and expects nothing in return. And maybe, just maybe, the next time someone calls clinics a handout, the room will remember her, the people will remember her, and the truth, no matter how softly it's spoken, will not fade. So now it's your turn. If something stirred in you, if you recognize yourself in those empty clinics, those silenced voices, those late-night ambulance rides that never came, then don't let this story stop here. Share it, speak it, tell your neighbor, write your representative, ask the hard questions no one else wants to ask, because silence is what they count on. They expect people to scroll past, to forget, to go quiet again when the headlines change. But what if we didn't? What if the next time someone tries to call care a handout, you raised your hand and said, no, that's survival? What if the next budget that guts health access wasn't met with tired shrugs, but with thousands of voices that had just found the words they were missing? This isn't about one side or another. It's about refusing to let people die because someone in a suit decided a wall was worth more than a life. And if you've never spoken up before, that's okay. Start now. One voice is how it starts. 10 voices is how it builds. 100 becomes a chorus. And when the room gets loud enough, even the ones who've stopped listening will have no choice but to turn around. So speak, act, fight, not for applause, not for politics, but for someone whose ZIP code has been used against them for far too long. Because if Jasmine Crockett could shake a room by telling the truth, then so can you. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.